Okay, we will figuratively gavel the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee to order here. Today is February 7, 2025. We have one item on the agenda today, and that is the agency presentation from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. With us is Commissioner Rebecca Lucero. Commissioner, welcome to the committee. Don't know if you have anyone else who will be participating in the presentation or not. So you can go ahead and let us know if you do. But go ahead and if you just note your own name and your position formally for the record, and go ahead and make your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lucero, and I'm the Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. And I'm not so used to using Zoom. As you know, we're more of a Teams folks on the executive branch side. And so I was trying to figure out how to put on my agency background, but I think we'll make it work this morning, especially because I have a PowerPoint slide to work off of here. And so I'm going to share from here, and hopefully this works okay. And I also just want to thank you so much for accommodating virtual time for me. As some of you may know, my family is getting ready to welcome a new baby into the family sometime this week or next. And so I appreciate the flexibility.
Congratulations, Commissioner. We're very happy for you and your family.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right. And can I just get a quick confirmation, Chair Latz, that you are able to see my slides here?
I can see it.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So joining me also here today off screen is Nico Bauer. He's the Government Relations Director. And also Sarah Weiss is our Public Policy and Outreach Director. And either of them are available to help answer any questions that you may have for our agency, especially if I'm out for a couple weeks here. So please feel free to reach out to anyone in our agency just to answer any questions for you. What we're going to talk about today is Minnesota's long history preventing discrimination, the workforce and equal pay certificates, and then our investigation work. Those are two biggest areas of work, or primary areas of work. And then, of course, we want to talk about Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan's 2025 budget. So let me actually start by talking about Minnesota's civil rights laws. And when I talk about civil rights laws, I often ask, hey, when you think about Minnesota and when it started passing civil rights laws, what time period do you think of? And understandably, across the board, most folks refer to the 1960s, and they talk about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Oh, I apologize. I'm not sure what happened there. I want you to know that Minnesota has a long history of preventing discrimination. And Minnesotans first actually demonstrated their commitment to civil rights when the Minnesota Constitution was ratified on May 11th of 1858 by prohibiting the practice of slavery in Minnesota. This was nearly a decade before the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed and ratified in 1865. And this is actually the law about Minnesota's Equal Accommodation Act. And this is from 1885. And it says that businesses that are open to the public here in Minnesota, so think hotels, restaurants, theaters, they're prohibited from preventing Black Minnesotans from having access to those establishments. This law was actually passed a few years after Frederick Douglass was in Minnesota and was prevented from staying in a few hotels. And this kind of law is called a public accommodation law. And so as you can see here, Minnesota legislators first passed this law in 1885. So again, long before the 1960s civil rights era that usually pops into our mind, 140 years ago. And it lives on today in Minnesota Human Rights Act. Which says that discrimination in public places, public businesses like hotels, theaters, coffee shops, trains, cannot deny someone access to these spaces because of their race, their color, their ethnicity, their religion, their sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, age, national origin, or disability. So this means that for a very long time, Minnesota, every Minnesotan is protected by and benefits from civil rights laws. And you see that over time here. So just a couple here more that I'll call out. We can certainly talk about some of these. Is in 1955, Minnesota legislators passed the 1955 Fair Employment Peace Act, outline unlawful discrimination in employment, which of course is built into the Minnesota Human Rights Act today. That was actually signed in 1967 by then Governor Harold Levander. It was renamed to the Minnesota Human Rights Act in 1973. Many of these laws passed with tremendous bipartisan support and/or in moments of trifecta. So, for instance, the Minnesota Human Rights Act in 1967 was passed by an all-Republican trifecta at the time. So, lots of bipartisan support for Minnesota's human rights laws throughout time. And over the years, state legislators have made changes to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. In 1973, discrimination in employment, housing, and education was prohibited on the basis of marital status. Hey, can't treat me differently because I am or am not married, disability, or status with regards to public assistance. Beginning in 1983, employers were required to provide reasonable accommodations to persons with disabilities. And this was before that law was passed, the ADA, at the federal level, quite a bit before. In 1993, in 1993, Minnesota became the first state to prohibit discrimination on the basis of both sexual orientation and gender identity. And just last year in August, Minnesotans with intermittent health conditions, think like diabetes or epilepsy, maybe somebody who has cancer in remission, now have protections from disability discrimination under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So again, that example of someone with epilepsy, they can request a reasonable accommodation from their employer without fear of being fired because of their need for that accommodation for their epilepsy. And previously, under that law, that same person would not be eligible for a reasonable accommodation and could have been terminated because of their medical condition. So lots of benefits and examples of Minnesotans benefiting from the Minnesota Human Rights Act across the board. The Minnesota Human Rights Act is tasked with two primary duties, as I've alluded to. Let me be much more specific. The first is to work. The first, I'll start here on the left, is our investigation work. And this is probably about what we're most well known for. And here you see us investigating, mediating, conciliating, litigating, and monitoring cases that Minnesotans have brought to the Department of Human Rights for a neutral fact-finding investigation. And the second is to work with businesses who are required to have workforce and equal pay certificates if they are contracting with the state. And so I want to start by talking about that second one there, the workforce certificates and the equal pay certificates. So these laws, the workforce certificates have been in place since the 1980s, and the equal pay certificates for about a decade now. And they say, hey, we just want to make sure that if we're spending state resources, that we're doing so in a way that is treating everyone equally under the law based on race, and also is paying men and women the same for the same work. And it works. Even yesterday, I was reviewing an audit that our team had done that had shown where women had been paying substantially less for the exact same position at a business. And we were able to rectify that both for those families who were getting paid less, but then also to help that business fix their systems so that it wouldn't happen again. To do this work and to do it well, we do need to collect, we're required to collect by statute and rules a variety of information from contractors. And it requires us to put in a lot of information. I know I talked about this a bit last year, frustrations that exist with the procurement process. And we heard that from our, I'm going to use the word customers, but customers include the contractors, other state agencies, a staff within my agency who are working with this and having to manually re-enter data, follow up with businesses who are missing information. And so we really have been working hard to build out a portal. So this workforce and equal pay certificate portal. And since I presented on this last year, we have actually made a ton of really exciting process. And so we're seeing it all come together. We're starting to build it out with our vendors. And it will make it substantially easier for vendors to be able to work directly with our agency to decrease duplicates, to make the interface and interactions much easier. And the contractors are really excited about these changes. We will be starting to test it with various contractors probably this summer, with our goal to launch it fully by the end of the year for everyone. So stay tuned, because that is something we've been working hard on and are excited about. As I mentioned, the other part of our work is investigation work. And this is the work that we're most well known for. And this is investigating cases of discrimination. And so this chart is showing some of the main areas where you see unlawful discrimination prohibited under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So in employment, in housing, in businesses open to the public, in schools, and then for all of these reasons. And so if you are making a decision because of somebody's age in employment, that can be a violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And so really it's saying, if you're making decisions, make them based on reasons that are not based on these characteristics about somebody, so that we can have a Minnesota that's really free from discrimination and people can really thrive with who they are and not be discriminated against by that. So let's talk about how our investigations kind of work. So first and foremost, you should know that cases come from Minnesotans directly, and they come from all over Minnesotans. The last time I checked, I think it was about 82 or 83 counties across Minnesota is where we have cases in at the moment. So the vast majority of counties we have in. Minnesotans can file cases, only cases that are under statute. So that's 363A and nothing more than that. And so that is the jurisdictional purview of this state agency by statute. And what Minnesotans are filing about is they're saying, hey, I believe I was unlawfully discriminated against, harassed, or retaliated against. And it is the responsibility of the Minnesota Human Rights Act by statute to conduct a neutral fact-finding investigation. We also offer mediation, which I'll mention in a second. And once we complete an investigation, the agency issues a finding under 363A, either finding probable cause or no probable cause of discrimination under the law. So let's talk about where these cases show up the most. The vast majority of cases over the entire time I've been in this position have consistently been in employment. You'll see a lot of cases also popping up in schools, housing, and businesses open to the public, though you can see the entire area that is covered in the Minnesota Human Rights Act itself. This is where the vast majority of cases are. Okay, but under what areas? So the top areas month after month are almost always disability, sex, and race. They could be in different orders, but that's where it consistently shows up. Let's see. How people reach out to our agency across Minnesota is if somebody believes they've been discriminated against, they go onto the website. It's www.mn.gov/MDHR and complete this online form to provide information about what they believe they experienced, where, when, and then somebody from our investigation team will contact them to determine if what they are talking about falls under the purview of the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and if so, how to move forward with a neutral investigation. And so we work to get back to people and move cases forward as efficiently, effectively, and proactively as possible. And so this chart zooms out and shows you the entire process. And it is a lengthy process because we really do want to make sure we get the legal analysis for each fact pattern correct. And of course, we are working through an inventory of many cases across the state. And we want to make sure, again, that we get that right. I do want to highlight our mediation program for alternative dispute resolution. It's something that I really love talking about because we've invested time and capacity into it, and it has phenomenal results. And I think it has phenomenal results because you hear from people that are participating, from the disputing parties, that it's a space for people to come together and actually hear each other, to work through the problems and to reach an agreement and find solutions that work for both disputing parties or all disputing parties. As a result, it allows the process to move a little bit quicker. And ideally, it can save money for businesses, landlords, or schools because they're able to avoid the cost of an investigation and possible litigation, and solve problems on the front end, which is always the goal with this kind of work. So let's talk about some of the cases that we do complete our investigations in and where we have found probable cause. There's been many cases here that I've talked about that I'll just highlight here around sexual harassment and assault. It is pervasive and persistent. It is really everywhere in schools, in workplaces. It is with against minors. Let's see, at the top of this case here, you have a case where a 24-year-old manager used his position of power to repeatedly sexually assault a 14-year-old employee. When we finished investigating this case, we found a probable cause of discrimination, and we reached a consent decree with McDonald's franchise. It requires them to make changes at all of its restaurants, and it ensures workers go through its daily work without being sexually harassed and assaulted, and that they have ways to report and they actually enforce and investigate the policies that they have in place. And there's examples of this across the state that you've seen. Of course, under Minnesota law, schools must foster learning environments free from discrimination and harassment. Students need to be able to fully participate in their schooling. That is so essential to a thriving Minnesota. And so our department has enforced the Minnesota Human Rights Act in several education cases. Our goal is to proactively support schools to stop harassment and discrimination from happening again. We want schools and teachers to be successful. My experience is just like many businesses, schools and teachers want to be successful here. So when we announce cases, we also work with school districts to take action to prevent this from happening again and to provide resources and policies that schools can look at across the board and implement to prevent bullying, harassment, and discrimination. We have also several cases that relate to reasonable accommodations, and Minnesotans have a right to request a reasonable accommodation allowed under the law. This is both, for instance, in disability accommodations as well as religious accommodations. As I mentioned earlier, disability discrimination is one of the most common types of cases we see. In fact, it's consistently the most common basis for discrimination. And under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, employers are obligated to provide a reasonable accommodation for employees and job applicants who request one for their disability. And really, this is actually one of those things that legally it comes down to oftentimes comes down to whether or not it imposes an undue hardship or whether or not it's actually a disability. And we really like to work with employers to say, hey, find creative solutions and paths forward because you want good workers. Workers want to do their job and do it well. Let's find accommodations that can work. And so we see these cases frequently, especially as the workforce continues to age gracefully, and we expect folks to continue to request additional accommodations in order to meet life circumstances. Same around religious accommodations. The law requires employers to reasonably accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practices. And that means that employers should be able to think of creative adjustments and reasonable adjustments to allow an employee to practice their religion. We have several cases around this. In a recent case, we have a Christian woman who was requesting a religious accommodation from her employer. Um, Employer was not even willing to look at a reasonable accommodation or to engage in the conversation around it. And so we found probable cause of discrimination for failing to provide a reasonable accommodation in that case. Um, so so yeah, there's those cases there. You've also heard me talk about pregnancy discrimination cases. Really, at the end of the day, we just work on a lot of cases across the board. So I just want to make sure I'm highlighting these for you. But pregnancy discrimination has been illegal in Minnesota since 1977. And it can include an employer denying temporary reasonable accommodations to a pregnant employee or firing an employer, denying a promotion because of that employee's pregnancy. There were a couple cases that we announced last year, but we see this still to this day. I think of everyone right now who's getting ready to, who's pregnant right now, getting ready to have a baby. And the thought of being afraid of losing your job, your health insurance, your care, it's just not something that we want families to be uh, struggling with in this moment. And so the Minnesota Human Rights Act says, hey, can't fire people because of their pregnancy. And so we have several cases that make that clear and supports employers for having better inclusive policies for people who are pregnant so that women can be assured that their pregnancies will be something that they're taken care of for. They can return to work when they're back. And I imagine most members of this committee have heard me talk about the department's consent decree with the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department. It was approved by the court on July 13th of 2023. And so this consent decree has been in place with the city of Minneapolis and the Department of Human Rights for quite some time. We have been doing the work. This was following a comprehensive investigation into the policies and practices of the Minneapolis Police Department and the city after the murder of George Floyd. Um, I can spend a lot of time talking about this case, and at some point you may want me to do a follow-up with you. I think the question that we get asked most about this at this moment is, hey, I understand the Department of Justice has their consent decree before a judge right now at the federal level. What is the status of that and how is that impacted? And so I want you to know that right now the DOJ has ordered an immediate halt on all civil rights work. And the administration has indicated that there will no longer be, the DOJ will no longer be moving forward with the consent decree. At the end of the day, though, I don't know how it will play out and what the judge will decide, and whether or not the DOJ will choose to pull out of that. But regardless of how the DOJ proceeds, as I mentioned, we have been here doing this work. This consent decree has been in place. The monitoring team has been on the ground, even this week, in fact, working on policy changes, on helping with implementation of enforcement. There's a lot of work. So our consent decree continues, period. The state law exists, even if the DOJ changes course on that. So now let me switch to talking about our budget, because we've talked a lot about the work that we've done. And as you can see from the work that we do, our agency is a people-powered agency. Most of our budget goes to staff compensation. Some of it goes to cover agency operating costs, but so overall, 90% of our expenses are our payroll, our rent, and our IT costs. And by far and away, our funding comes from the general fund. So we are, excuse me, I'm sorry, we have right here, what you see is about a little bit over a 2% increase from our adjusted base budget for next year. And of course, my notes on this are on paper instead of on the computer, so I apologize. I'm switching here to my notes. And so we have no other budget requests, however. This is the only operating adjustment that we have in place here. It's a very modest one, and as I've talked about throughout this entire conversation, I think it's a really good investment for the state because every Minnesota is protected by and benefits from civil rights laws. Um, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this one piece as well, and anything else you might have. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I've been trying to scroll through the participants here to see if I see any hands raised. I haven't seen any yet. But let's open it up right now and see if any members of the committee have questions for Commissioner Lucero. Raise your hand or just speak right up. Senator Pappas.
Thank you. I just want to thank Commissioner. That was really, really an interesting history lesson. Going back, it makes me proud to be Minnesotan. And I was one of the co-authors of the 93 bill. So I'm also the equal pay law that you're implementing. So thank you so much for all your work in this area. And, you know, years ago, we had a backlog in cases, long time ago. How long does it take you to work through a case? And do you have any kind of a significant backlog?
Commissioner Lucero.
Thank you, Chair Latz. Senator, first and foremost, let me just start by thanking you for all of your work on civil rights. As you can see, and we have a lot more information, it is Minnesota legislators for a long time who have led the way on ensuring that civil rights is deeply embedded into the fabric of Minnesota and continue to push that forward. And many of you have introduced a lot of these bills or worked on improving this over time. So let me just start with that. We take our work very seriously. So we have a healthy inventory of cases that come in that we are working all of the time. And so we work really hard to move those cases as efficiently and effectively as possible. I think one thing that I wanted to point out to you, and you might have seen it in your agency profile case, is that we actually, when this agency profile case came out, we have had a 43% increase in the total number of charges that Minnesotans have filed between the last fiscal year, and actually that has continued to shoot up this last reporting period. We expect that to increase even further, and we're already still seeing signs of that. Despite those incredible increases, you'll also see in your book there that our inventory levels have actually stayed relatively consistent. And that is because we are working cases so efficiently and effectively. And so I'm really proud of the work that we've done there.
Senator Pappas, follow up? All right, thank you. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Senator Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question that I'm sorry I couldn't come for the first part of your presentation, but I certainly like what you've said, and also that you're interested in a lot of these types of discriminations that are happening. And I'm wondering, because I was involved in trying to encourage school districts to put religious holidays on their calendars so that they don't have conflicts with even with teachers and student holidays and assignments. And now we have the situation in Eden Prairie and I believe it's Eden Prairie, where we have graduation scheduled for a holiday for Muslim students. And it's quite a number that are what would you say, being affected by it. And I'm wondering if that is something that has come to a complaint, and is that something that goes to Minnesota to help negotiate a resolution to it?
Commissioner Lucero.
Senator Carlson, thank you so much for the question. So I am going to defer talking about any specific case that we may or may not have because of the data practice rules that are in place. What I do want to, though, speak to broadly is that behind the discrimination law for Minnesota is really about creating a place where we can really see the dignity and humanity of each other, and where we can live in a world free from discrimination. And so some of those systems or policies that you're talking about are really smart that businesses, schools can put in place that just help you say, hey, this isn't something that I don't necessarily think of, but of course these things are important. And I can be thoughtful to people about this, just as I'm asking them to be thoughtful about my religion too. And so just putting it right on your calendar helps you avoid conflict before it even starts. And so I think it's a really good process for all of us to put into practice, to help us um, prevent discrimination from happening in the first place, which is always, I think, our first and foremost goal. And then ultimately to really make sure that everyone can live with dignity. That's, I think, what we're going for here.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. And I'm thinking of another
Senator
incident
Carlson.
thank you, Mr. Chair. That happened in another school district where there was a group of students that were making let's say objectionable videos and posting them online, and the students were identified and the victims were identified, and I don't know where that went and if that is an activity that has gone down since I think this was probably 3 or 4 years ago. And is that something that comes to the department? Because I don't know, school districts can investigate it, but I don't know where they go from there.
Commissioner Lucero.
Thank you, Chair. Senator Carlson, if anyone believes that they have faced discrimination in schools, like the example that you're talking about right now, harassment, they can and should contact our office. And so there are many educations that we have right now. I'm not sure of what specific case you might be referencing there. And schools are facing different issues around this, and we want to make sure that they can be successful there. So mostly what I'd like to say to anyone who feels like they may be experiencing discrimination at schools is they can and should feel comfortable reaching out to our agency. They can reach out with their parent. And we could see if it is something that's covered by the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And if so, we can conduct a neutral fact-finding investigation.
Good, thank you. I can feed that back. Thank you.
Yeah.
A note for the record that we have had a quorum of senators check in. Commissioner, can you comment more generally? Are school district scheduling issues that conflict with religious holidays? Would they fall within the parameters of the Human Rights Act?
Across the board, whether or not a specific situation is a violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act is something that I would want to have more information and investigate on. As I mentioned, when it comes to accommodations, religious accommodations, it is a more nuanced conversation about what the facts are that might offer flexibility around that. And so I couldn't tell you offhand if something de facto is without having more investigation about the situation. And certainly the purpose of anti-discrimination laws is about creating spaces where everyone can be really successful. And so I would certainly encourage greatly folks to be thoughtful about those things. I have made the same mistake. I will say that I have scheduled something on a day of worship that was not something that I had on my radar. And when someone brought it to my attention, I simply apologized and rescheduled it. And so it is actually something that all of us can become better at doing. And so those holidays are also on my schedule as well, so I can be thoughtful about them. It's not necessarily on my radar. And so where we mess up there, we can quickly fix that moving forward.
For me, I think obviously every individual situation is important if they feel they've been discriminated against, but I think even more importantly are the discrimination cases that never happen because of the education and information that our Minnesota businesses and agencies and organizations receive from the Department of Human Rights about what is and is not acceptable. The portal that you're putting together for contractors with the state, but also generally the education that you provide to businesses around the state, I think are at least as, if not even more important than the individual cases that you investigate. You can probably prevent a whole lot more discrimination that way, even as you seek to remedy the individual situations. Any other members of the committee have any questions or comments?
Chair Latz, I just had a
Senator
quick,
Weston.
thank you. I will say just to Senator Carlson's point, Eden Prairie actually did change their graduation date. And it was a situation certainly where the community kind of flooded the school and said, hey, this isn't consistent with what our values are. And so they did change the date. But, you know, I mean, this does happen frequently for Jewish holidays. Muslim holidays often are the ones that seem to get overlooked, and things get scheduled for Yom Kippur or Eid, and it creates a lot of kind of just bad feelings for folks. But I'm glad that they resolved that quickly, and I would agree with Commissioner Lucero that a lot of times, if something is brought to the attention of an organization or a school, if they respond sort of with some sensitivity instead of defensiveness and say, "Oh, yep, that's a situation that we certainly did not intend to do that," and and resolve it in a way that is shows that sensitivity and that care for others as incredibly important. And then I will also just say, I think the mediation program is an enormous opportunity. As someone who does mediation myself, one of the problems with when people get diverted into an adversarial process, whether it's litigation or something else, it becomes a situation where a person may be inclined to want to issue an apology, but they can't because it's an admission of guilt or liability. And I think oftentimes when conflict happens, what people really are looking for is an acknowledgement and an apology. And so the mediation process really offers an opportunity for each party to speak. The process is confidential. Um, each party is able to hear the other party's point of view, perhaps in a way they hadn't understood it previously. And it not only just resolves that situation and often prevents it from going to litigation, but it actually transforms that dynamic and that relationship between those people so that moving forward, they have a different foundation and a basis from which to a better communication and resolve disputes in the future. And so I'm a big believer in mediation. And again, a lot of times people really are just looking for an apology and some acknowledgement of the hurt. And the formal process does not often allow that, because as lawyers, we are always reluctant to have our clients, admit anything. So thank you. And Commissioner Lucero, I just appreciate so much your work and the work for all of the folks working in the department. You do really good work, and I appreciate you being here with us today.
Just to piggyback on that, just to note, you don't have to lawyer up to file a charge of discrimination or contact the Department of Human Rights. Sometimes people do contact lawyers or retain lawyers first, but my guess is most often they reach out to the department without having an attorney representing them, and that's just fine. No problem either way. And same with organizations that might be accused of discriminating. They don't have to, I don't think they have to have a lawyer to go through the Human Rights Department process. If they end up in litigation, corporation is required to have counsel. But you don't necessarily need one, especially if you go into early stage mediation. It's a way to save the attorney's fees as well. That's the hassle and time of the additional process. Any other members of the committee have any questions, comments? Speak up. I'm not seeing anyone else with a hand up. All right. We will proceed with our budget process in due course, Commissioner. As you know, appreciate the careful budgeting that you're doing here and your request as well. Don't know how long you will be directly working with us on these issues this spring. But we know that members of your staff will be fully capable of answering questions that we have and being an advocate for the department. So we will proceed accordingly. Wish you and your family the very best. Happy, healthy, everything. All right. Before we sign off, anything else? Any members of the committee? All right. Thank you all for fitting in our schedule here today so we can provide reasonable accommodation to the Commissioner of Human Rights. We'll see you all back at the Capitol on Monday. Have a great weekend, and we are adjourned.